Quran says you have to have 4 upstanding male witnesses who witness the act of fornication in order for the person to get convicted, if they don't confess. Muslim scholars understood seeing the act to mean they actually have to see, the jurist described, the pen go into the inkwell, if you will. That's what they say. So you actually have to see that. That's very difficult to pull off. Now, but where is it not difficult? Come on, American males.
On TV?
Porn!
There you go.
Right? I just said something right there. But here's the thing. Okay, first of all, videotapes can be doctored. So videotape is shubha, it's an ambiguity, so you can't take that in a hudud case. But there's the people on the set. There's way more than 4 people working on the set. So they will all be witnesses. But in order to be accepted, you have to be an upstanding witness. And if you work on a porn set, you're by definition not an upstanding witness. So you would not have, by definition, no witness could testify to that case, and you couldn't prosecute, or you couldn't convict the couple of accused. There's my shubha introduced on the That's actually it.
If you look at the number of witnesses in every other case other than adultery or fornication, there's a maximum, or there's a minimum of 2 witnesses. But since
most of the time it's 2 witnesses. For anything like theft or killing or injury, you have to have 2 witnesses.
yeah, but scholars will tell you that for fornication or adultery, because you have 2 people committing the crime, you need 2 witnesses per person. So that's where the 4 comes in.
Okay. I never heard that, but it's a great one. Yes, thank you very much for that. And I got to showcase my explanation. Remember, Professor of the cake.
Maria's fine. Well, first of all, I wanted to make you feel better and tell you there was class at 5:55.
You know, I've never abused people who left before, but I think I reached some, I just, it's been happening to me a lot lately, and I think I can be out. So apologize to those guys. I feel bad.
But one of them was my students, that's fine. But I wanted to actually say, with regard to the hudud, you mentioned that they didn't necessarily injure an individual person. But isn't it the case that jurists saw these kinds of crimes as having a high social cost? Right, so in other words, like, if people freely fornicated and committed adultery, lines of lineage and family structure and children's rights would essentially be harmed by this. Or if you had a society where people could steal with relative impunity, again, it wouldn't be a very, it wouldn't be a very secure kind of place. I mean, isn't there a sense also, I mean, specifically in how the jurists thought about this, that these were deeply harmful to society as a whole, even if not to a particular individual?
That's a very good point. I didn't, and I suppose I should have been more clear about this, that I'm not saying that these things are not actually harmful, and I think that you're completely right. They didn't sit there and say, they thought, even if someone sits and gets drunk in their basement, there's still a huge harm that comes from that. No one is going to stay their way. What I was trying to stress is that if we think about harm in terms of really going out and clearly materially hurting another person, like hitting them or killing them or something like that. So that's a different, much more superficial or evidence surface harm that we can measure and sense very easily, as opposed to like deeper social harms that might express themselves and manifest over a long period of time or in very subtle ways. What I was trying to stress is that hudud crimes, they're the most serious affronts in God's eyes, but they're not actually, that seriousness doesn't correspond 100% with what a human society would consider, metaphysical and deep social things aside, evident harms in that society.
Individual society.
Yeah, especially individualist societies. Yes, good point. Bilal again. Wait, yes, Bilal, go ahead.
I'm sorry, if you look at the hudud, just one more in Surah Al-Ma'idah, Allah says that the punishment for those who fight Allah and His Messenger and cause mischief in this world, in the world, is that they be killed or exiled. So it's a had, and in essence, it's because of the harm that they're causing to society, rather than just between them of God.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't mention all the hudud crimes. I left out, I think, 2, because the 2 crimes which are complicated to get into in a short period of time. That's one of them. Harab, or ifsad, highway robbery, or causing corruption and injustice in the land. Questions on this side? Yes, the young lady.
Thank you.
With the young man.
Yeah, thank you. So you mentioned the 2 witnesses, say in the case of like a hudud theft. If you do have the 2 witnesses, then you do have to go with the full punishment?
No, because the confession of the thief is required.
So without the confession, I mean, if they say they didn't do it, but you have the 2 witnesses.
Doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
It's not a. It doesn't mean that the thief walks away with the new iPod or whatever. Like, that was easy. No, it just means that the theft is not dealt with at the level of hudud. It drops down into the ta'zir crimes. Yes, gentlemen.
The question I have is about this distinction between Islam sin and crime. It was in the good olden times when I was growing up, it was very easy to distinguish between the 2. Every crime, at least my parents showed me, considered them as sins. But every sin may not be a crime. But in this, at this time, there are certain, for example, in some Western European countries, there are certain things which Muslim women are required to do, which are considered sins, but if they don't do it, it is considered a crime. So how are Muslim Jews,
Like, what's an
for example,
example?
removing hijab, for example, they are not allowed to,
Yeah.
wear the hijab in public. So how do Muslim jurists deal with this situation where something which is considered a sin, if people don't, if try to abstain from it, it becomes a crime.
Yeah. So what happens if you are not permitted to do something that you're required to do, and it is not it doesn't involve another person. So you're not, I'm required to pay back a loan or something, but I'm not required to. This doesn't involve another person. That's correct. So here the issue is not necessarily sin versus crime. The issue is what do Muslims do in situations when they are not allowed to practice their religion in the way that they are required to practice their religion. So when it comes to, let's say, women covering their face, only one Sunni school of law categorically requires women to cover their faces. The other schools of law either have one opinion saying it's required, one opinion saying it isn't. So it is required in Islamic law by consensus of Muslim scholars, at least classical Muslim scholars, that women cover their hair. So if you could say, if I'm not allowed to cover my face, I'm not allowed to meet the most stringent requirements of the religion, but I'm still within the realm of accepted disagreement. So in that case, a Muslim in France or in Netherlands or who's not allowed to cover their face, they can still live it there if they wanted to. They're not being prevented from practicing their religion in things that are required of them to do. If, however, you're not allowed to cover your hair, then that's something that's required. And the majority argument of Muslims scholars throughout history was that Muslims cannot live in a place where they are prevented from practicing their religion. So, if, like the United States, I'm allowed to pray wherever I want. Okay? I'm allowed to take time to go over Friday to pray. Women are allowed to cover their hair. We'll see about this. It'll be interesting to see this. What's that crazy store with the naked people in the pictures? Abercrombie and Fitch, right? When we'll see this case when it comes out about whether this woman was wronged in not being discriminated against and not being allowed to wear her hijab or being fired because of that. So the United States is a country where it's, generally Muslims are always going to be allowed to live because they're always going to be allowed to practice their religion. There was another opinion which was the most famous person who gave it is a scholar named al-Bukhari in the early, died I think 1510 or 1511 in the Common Era. And it was a fatwa he gave to Muslims who were then at the time living under Christian rule in the conquered areas of Iberia, of Spain, that were conquered by Christians. And they were being forced to eat pork, forced to drink alcohol, forced to attend church. The majority opinion, and this was the majority of the most kind of what became the fatwas that won the day, is they have to leave. And eventually in 1525, the Spanish kingdom expelled, forced. So like we always talk about Jews being expelled from Spain in 1492. Many times more, thousands more Muslims were expelled from Iberia or tortured until they converted. So that never gets brought up. I don't know why this is the case. What Bahrani said, however, was no, it's more important for you to stay there and preserve some presence of Islam there, even if you are forced to consent. So just in your heart, you don't intend to do these things. The problem is that it doesn't work out. People can't keep, with a few exceptions in history, most religious communities cannot survive if they are forced to dissimulate completely. Eventually they will. Especially religion is kind of as public and as communal as Islam, which doesn't survive. And sure enough, Muslims didn't survive in Iberia.
I think we had one question over here.
Yes. Saeed, oh, come on. This is a Georgetown student. What are you doing here?
Listen, your excellent ideas. If I didn't come, I would miss your point.
Thank you.
So I have a question. So Foucault talks about the birth of the prison in the European context, punishments, transforming from bodily punishments to the punishments like disciplinary punishments in a prison. How do you classify the punishments of Islam? Do you see any transition throughout the history, or bodily punishments? Prison it doesn't make sense for the early modern era because you cannot keep people for so long, in a confined.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because even in the United States, I mean, we have a prison population that's like the third highest in the world, or is it number one? I can't remember. Number one, because we execute the third most people. We imprison the largest prison population. If you don't have tremendous state resources to spend, or in our case, to give to fat, prison businessmen. It's really hard. It's a very, very difficult thing to put people in prison and maintain them. It takes a lot of money, takes a lot of resources, takes a lot of attention. So yes, prison was not generally by any pre-modern society the favorite form of punishment. It's too difficult. Muslims did have prisons even from the very early period, the early period of the Umayyad Caliphate, but they were generally used for political prisoners. Basically sending people. There was an island in the Red Sea off the coast of Egypt, actually, I think, which was an island where it still exists today. I think it's a resort town today. That was the place people were sent. Prison was more of a temporary thing that you would do to people during a trial. If somebody's, is accused of stealing something and they're going to make off with this thing unless you detain them until you can get the other people in court and have the trial, people were put in prison. People would be put into this little temporary prison if the judge thinks that they're not telling the truth, especially in that equity court, in the Balaam court. They could be put in there until they, to cool their heels until they decide to tell the truth. But the most favorable forms of punishment were corporal punishment. There are two things: either a stern talking to and public humiliation, which in a highly individualistic society isn't that bad. If I go to Virginia traffic court and I get yelled at by the judge because I made a erratic lane change, which I apparently did once, then I get embarrassed in front of those people. I don't know any of these people. If I'm in my little town and I'm getting, raked over the coals by a judge in front of all these other people I know who are sitting around to listen, that's a really serious type of punishment. So then you would go up the ladder to corporal punishment. The general type was lashes, but especially the Ottomans loved bastinado, getting hit on the bottom of your feet with a reed. And it's a funny story. Last time I was here, George, I also told an embarrassing family story, but I'll tell it now. My mother, God rest her soul, she can't be prosecuted for this, but now, once we were in the closet, we were looking through a closet, we found this really kind of weird back scratching reed or something. My mom said, this looks just like a bastinado that the Ottomans love to use. And I said, I think I was about 10 or 11 years old. I said, that doesn't hurt. What is this thing? She said, okay, let me see your foot. I'll give you a try. And she whacked the bottom of my foot a few times, and it really hurt. It really hurt a lot. So bastinado is an effective form of punishment. Or other things like, I mentioned being forced to do manual labor. In Ottoman Istanbul, after the night prayer, which nowadays is around, what, like 8 p.m., I can't remember exactly when it is, it's changing, the time change. After that, there was curfew in the city. If you were caught out after that, you wouldn't get in trouble. You'd be forced to do labor, like carry stuff or carry firewood around until dawn. So there's always forms of punishment. Things that were not really used are fines. You could be forced to pay money that you owed for damages, but to be kind of a punitive fine, this didn't really happen until the modern period. That's when Muslims start to adopt punitive measures from the West. Okay, yes.
Yeah, so one of the things that I thought was really interesting is the fact that I'm always hearing, critics of Islam talk about how, apostasy in Islam is such a huge deal, they'll kill people for leaving Islam, which originally didn't make sense to me because, when I studied the life of Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I found out that, there were certain individuals in that Meccan and Medina time period which they had accepted Islam and they later decided to leave Islam, and they were still able to live in peace. And God says in the Quran that, there is no compulsion in religion, and it's also very clear that, human beings, we have free will, He's given us logic and reason. He's allowed for us to choose and decide how we want to live our lives. So when I kind of looked deeper into the matter, what I kind of found, and I'm just basically seeking clarification from you on this matter, is that apostasy in Islam that's punishable by death is more or less, related historically to those individuals who may be, falsely converted to Islam with the intention of, during Islamic rule, trying to maybe, steal information from the Islamic, caliphate or the government, and then kind of, then later leaving Islam, only to go to the enemy and then disclosing that information, which, in today's society, if you go and do that, they call it treason, and that's still punishable by death, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I think that you're on to something. I really wish I would get asked this question because it's taking me a while to answer. But the issue of apostasy is a very important issue. If you look at the ISIS group, what is it that allows ISIS to kill Muslims in Iraq and Syria or wherever? It's the fact that ISIS, unlike Sunni and Shia Islam, ISIS declares people unbelievers or apostates for committing crimes and doing things they don't agree with. Otherwise, in Sunni and Shia Islam, if you commit a crime or you commit a sin, you're just a bad person. You're still a Muslim. So it's the death penalty offense for apostasy that allows them to do this, that gives them the tool to justify Islamically their killing. The issue, and you're completely correct, when you look at the Quran, you see a very clear statement that there's la ikraha fi din, there's no compulsion in religion. And the problem arises when you look in the statements made by the Prophet, that are considered authentic by Muslim scholars, at least by Sunni scholars. One statement, man baddala dinahu faqtuluhu, whoever changes their religion, kill them. And another one that says, I'll just say that in English, the blood of a Muslim is not licit to shed except for three things. Someone who murders somebody and is punished by execution, for an adulterer, a married person who commits adultery, and a man taraka dinahu mufarakan bil jama'ah, person who leaves their religion and forsakes the community, the Muslim community. These were taken by Muslim scholars almost in complete consensus, and it's very rare that Muslim scholars really come to complete consensus on something, but almost complete consensus that apostasy, leaving Islam, is a death penalty offense, based on those two statements of the Prophet primarily. But what's interesting is if you look at the second statement, you get an insight into what you're saying, which is it's not someone who leaves their religion as a Muslim, it's someone who leaves their religion and forsakes the Muslim community. And the key here, and the reason also why Muslim scholars so conclusively and as a body came to this conclusion about the death penalty offense for apostasy is because of the nature of their community, the nature of how they understood identity. And this is not just the case for Muslims, this is the case for Christians and Jews, also in the pre-nation-state period. Before people's primary identity and primary loyalty was defined by a nation-state, a territorial area filled with people who were all French or Dutch or whatever, or American, before that became our primary way of identifying ourselves, and also the primary state unit which considered our obedience and our loyalty to be required, Before that, it was loyalty to your religious community, whether it's Latin Christendom or whether it's the Ummah, the Muslim community in the case of Islamic civilization. So that was your community, that was your nation. And to leave it was to upset the order of the world that these scholars understood. And it was understood by the rulers and people in their societies. They didn't care about people's personal conscience. If somebody didn't believe in Islam, if somebody sat and drank alcohol, and a lot of Muslim rulers drank in carouse and murdered people with impunity. They didn't care what people believed on the inside. What they cared was their outward obedience to this overall confessional order. So what happens in really the late 19th century, but it really starts gaining momentum in the early 20th century, is Muslim scholars who see themselves now in a world of nation states start to rethink the crime of apostasy and the issue of apostasy, because it doesn't make sense if it's no longer being Muslim that's important, but being Egyptian. Why does it really matter if you're an Egyptian Muslim or an Egyptian Christian? Right? It doesn't really matter anymore. It doesn't have any. There's no clear formal political problem. So what they do exactly what you identified. They say, look, this is not about religion. This apostasy isn't a matter of someone changing religion as a matter of personal conscience. It's about someone going out and really upsetting the political order of their time. So scholars like Yusuf al-Qaradawi, the Egyptian Mufti who lives in Qatar, he divides, and this is representative of a whole big trend in Muslim scholars, divides apostasy into what's called Ridda al-Kubra or Ridda al-Sughra. Sorry, Ridda al-Ta'adidiyya or Ridda ghayr al-Ta'adidiyya, which is, the first one is public transgressory, or apostasy that is publicly transgressive, and apostasy that is not publicly transgressive. If you just privately happen to not convert to Christianity, and you just go about your life as a Christian, no one cares. But if you go out and say, have a big sign saying, oh, Muslims need to all abandon their religion, Islam is a terrible religion, it's a horrible way to live, etc., then he would consider this to be precisely that apostasy that does require serious punishment. Oh wait, hang on. The young lady was, I want to be equitable to my female audience. Yes.
Assalamualaikum, first of all.
All.
I wanted to ask about madhabs, school of thought, and is it necessary to pick one to follow, or can you just go with majority opinions, scholars in general from different schools as well?
Or you're not going to go easy on the non-specialist audience here, I see. So the question is, to what extent a Muslim has to follow one specific school of law. The answer to the question is that there are several answers. But one approach, you can see this one answer tends to be found in the Hanafis of the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman heartland, and South Asia, which is you follow one madhab, and not only that, but you follow the main principal opinion of that madhab, unless necessity forces you to leave the main rule of that madhab for another madhab. And really, really bad necessity, if you don't tell anyone about this, you can go to another school of law. They don't like to talk about that. The opposite end of the spectrum is kind of like, look, these are all legitimate opinions in the Islamic tradition. Your intention is what's important. God is going to punish you or reward you based on your intention. So if you want to go out and put together like a Mr. Potato Head made of all little easy rulings, that's fine. These are all allowed. But God is going to judge you. And these aren't things that are happening in front of a court. So you're not wronging other people. This is your own life you're leading. The middle answer, or the middle ground, is that you should stick with one madhab unless either you believe that there's evidence that another school of law's opinion is stronger, or there's some need in your life, or justifying need that would make it allowed for you to take another ruling. So, for example, in the 3 of the 4 Sunni schools of law, if a dog comes up and drools on you and licks you and grabs your hand, like my neighbor's dog does all the freaking time, my pants, I can't pray in my pants, I have to wash my pants several times, I gotta wash my hands several times, okay? That's a big pain. In the Maliki school of law, one of the Sunni schools, dogs are ritually clean. So the dog may look, drools on my pants, drools on my hand, that's no big deal. In this case, in the context of American suburban life or even urban life, we have dogs everywhere, and Muslims don't want to go like running around with dogs chasing them all the time, then it would make sense to take the Maliki ruling in this case. But on conditions, you can't make, remember we talked about the Mr. Potato Head? You can't make a Mr. Potato Head that self-negates. So you can't make a Mr. Potato Head that no one would accept. So let's say in the Maliki school, a dog comes up and licks my hand. Okay, but I'm taking the Maliki ruling on that. Now I go into, then I go into I go out on the street and I step on cat poo. Step in cat poo. Now, other schools of law would call this is ritually unclean. In the Hanbali school of law, however, it's not ritually unclean. So I'm going to take the Hanbali ruling here. And then I go and I do my prayers, and because I don't want to, my hair is looking really good that day, so I do my ritual pure. I don't want to wipe my whole head like the Maliki school requires. I take the Shafi ruling where I only have to wipe part of my head. So now, if I pray, I'm ritually pure according to the Malikis on one thing, ritually pure according to the Hanbalis on another thing, but ritually impure according to the Malikis. I've wiped my head according to the Shafi school, and I haven't met the Maliki requirements for the head wiping. So I have this Frankenstein monster that no one, as a composite, no one would accept. That you're not allowed to do. But I would also say it's easy to pick a madhab just for issues of praying and fasting. It just gives you what to do. If you make a mistake in prayer, you just follow that madhab's rule about what you do. It's easier than just trying to cobble together your own version of stuff.
Thank you.
So like this guy here, he was up and then I distant for
No problem. Thank you very much. So you were given the example earlier of how about in the island people would eat food from the water beside fish due to necessity of living in an island. So my question is, what helped Muslims and Muslim scholars to distinguish between those behaviors that they can change due to necessity or local culture and those behaviors that they can't?
That's actually super, super good question. Right? Where do you draw the line between the things that, like drinking alcohol, not allowed to ever change, and the things that you can change? There are two factors, I think. This is my own analysis. There are two factors. One is, to what extent are these things subject to disagreement? So if there's a high degree of scholarly derivation, if the textual sources, the Quran and the statements of the Prophet aren't really clear, if there's ambiguity or a lot of room for disagreement, or people disagree on whether a certain statement of the Prophet is authentic or not, then you have kind of a room created for allowable disagreement. And within that disagreement, then you're within the range, you're within the pale of acceptable opinion. So I couldn't come and declare what you're doing to be totally unacceptable in Islam, because actually it's not totally unacceptable. It's unacceptable for certain people. I could, if you made this Frankenstein monster that I'm talking about, then we would all reject that. But an individual ruling that other people disagree with, they can't object to. The second thing is, it also depends on the kind of origin of that ruling. So, by the way, the rule about fish in the Hanafi school is based precisely on one kind of idiosyncratic interpretation of Quranic verses and acceptance of hadiths that other Sunnis don't accept. The second thing is, to what extent the Prophet in his rulings, he created exceptions for rules. So some of his rules are actually exceptions to other rules. So in general, Muslims cannot buy and sell things that don't exist yet. So this certainly applies to like futures and derivatives and things like that. But it also applies to things like, let's say I want to sell you the fruit of this tree. When this tree fruit becomes ripe, I will sell them to you. We don't know what they're going to be. Are they going to get destroyed by a storm? Is it going to be a bad year? Is there not going to be enough water? Is it just a fluke and it's not going to produce as many dates as I think it is? So you can't buy and sell things that don't exist. However, you can buy and sell things that don't exist if it's necessary for crop production. Let's say I'm a farmer. I only get money when I have my crop come in. I need to pay people and buy things and feed my family the rest of the year. So the Prophet allows what's called salam, where I basically go and I buy seed from you and get a loan from you and buy clothes from you and a donkey from you, and I will pay you that amount when my crop comes in. It's basically a purchase on credit. Now, I've sold something that doesn't really exist yet, but this isn't necessary. So that becomes then, that creates an exception for things like orders for factory goods. Or let's say I order a shirt from a shirt store, and they make that shirt custom for me, but they charge my credit card when I buy the thing. In theory, I've bought something that doesn't exist yet, but in the United States, we all know if they send me a shirt that I don't like, or they don't send me the shirt, I have means to recoup my money very easily. And so this is accepted in the culture. That's a similar, that starts fitting under this exception that's already been created. So a lot of the things that are, let's say, breaking away from a well-established rule based on local custom, do so because there's already been exceptions created by the Prophet or early jurists to that overall rule. Am I allowed to keep going?
Okay, actually, we're just going to do one more question for the sake of time. We have this space reserved until 7 o'clock. And I believe this gentleman here wanted to ask a question.
Yes, sorry. I'll talk to you after. Yes, go ahead, gentleman in the back.
I just had a question when it comes to marriage.
Pick the right lady.
Inshallah, of course. And when you were to go speak to her father, how necessary is it for him to request a dowry if he chooses to waive that right? Whoa, because I know that.
So, I'm not a mufti, so I'm not going to answer your question, but I will analyze your question. Okay. Which is, this is an interesting, in Muslim marriage, basically, I've mentioned this before, but the groom gives dower, money to the bride. Now, since the 1000s is the common era, but it really becomes common in the 1800s, 1700s, 1800s, what you Muslims would do, and actually you see the same thing with Jews living in Islamic civilization, is you pay an upfront dower and then a back-end dower. So the back-end dower you only pay if you divorce your wife without cause. So let's say you just say one day, I'm sick of you. I'm out of here. Then you have to pay the back-end dower. And what happens is the back-end dower starts becoming quite massive, because it allows the family of the girl and the girl to request a very high price or put a high value on her. And this has a lot to do with social standing. And yet the husband doesn't bankrupt himself when he's getting married. And it's also a guarantee that he's not just going to divorce her willy-nilly. Right? But here's the problem. A lot of times people talk about Islamic divorce law is unfair to women. I actually think one could make a better argument that it's unfair to men. I'll tell you why. A wife has lots of options out of marriage. She can, the most common way in marriages, and based on our court records in the medieval period, is the woman would do what's called a khula. She would basically either negotiate her way out of marriage with her husband. She'd say, I relinquish my right to the dower. You don't have to pay my maintenance. I'm not here. Or if the husband doesn't want this, she goes to the judge and says, I want to do this. She can also go to the judge and say, my husband's mistreating me, my husband's cruel to me, my husband's not doing this, he's not doing that, he's not fulfilling his obligations, he's hurting me, he's doing whatever. And then the judge can do what's called tafriq, which is judicial separation. He can actually just terminate the marriage. She gets her dowry money, she gets her maintenance payments, and she leaves. The husband, if he divorces the wife unilaterally, which is the kind of, it's called talaq, it's the thing that people always talk about in the media about Muslim, bad Muslim divorce law. He can do that without he can do it unilaterally. He can do it in 5 seconds. But he has to pay the back end dower, which is going to be, like for me, if I had to pay my back end dower, I would bankrupt myself. I don't have that much money. Okay? So, I'm actually kind of stuck in this situation. My wife can keep, hitting me on the head and kicking me and, making fun of me all the time and things like that. And I said, I can't get out of this. I have to pay the back. I'm not going to lose all my money, et cetera, et cetera. What's the husband's option? He also can go to the judge and ask for a judicial separation based on the fact that my wife is hitting me and making fun of me and kicking me and things like that. So in the end, the two end up with kind of the same option, best option for their own interest. The reason I'm bringing this up is because my advice to you, as a fellow person, is if somebody makes an outrageous demand of you financially for the front-end dowry, then let me tell you this. It's very important to get along with your in-laws. It's very important. It's very, very important. Even if you don't have a lot to do with them. If your wife's not happy with her family, if her family isn't happy with her, you're going to suffer, your marriage is going to suffer. So if someone's putting that bar up to you, what they're basically saying is, we don't want you. And when I was younger, I would have gotten all upset about that. It's, this isn't right, things like that. But as an older person, I think I would just say, okay, no, I'm not going to put myself in this situation. If they put a very high back-end dower, that's pretty standard, and it doesn't mean that they don't like you. It's them valuing their daughter, and the daughter valuing herself. Then you just have to ask yourself, what happens if the thing is, if you're living in like a Muslim country, then you usually have to pay the back-end dower. But if you're living in the United States, then you could try to say that when you go to divorce court, or family law court, that this is a religious thing, you're not bound by it. I'm not advocating that, but I think it's dishonest. But there's lots of cases in the United States where the issue of dowry payment, back-end dowry payment comes up in divorce settlements. And you see what ends up happening is, sometimes American courts will make the guy pay, sometimes they won't. They'll say it's just a religious thing, it's not a real contract. But you see that the parties end up, if the Islamic argument is in their interest, they use it. If the Islamic argument is against their interest, they try to get out of it. So people are kind of creatures of interest wherever they are. Thanks a lot, everybody. Enjoy the food.